Okay, so I just saw Miyazaki's directorial debut being Lupin III, The Castle of
Cagliostro.
and it's the only Lupin movie that Miyazaki ever directed. I think my gut reaction is that, it was good. It was a fun movie. Um, I think it's not perfect by any means, and I think there's stuff that could be improved in it. It had me laughing. The action was gripping for the most part. For people that haven't seen any Lupin movies or series or read the manga or anything beforehand, I think this movie makes for a pretty solid like jumping on point. You don't need to know anything about Lupin or the franchise or any of the pre-existing properties before you can just jump in and watch this movie. It's pretty clear off the bat. You get that Lupin is a gentleman thief working with his friend Jigen. They've gone to the fictional European country of
Cagliostro.
in order to get to the bottom of a counterfeiting ring. And that's sort of like, the basic setup. The movie had a really promising beginning. I definitely found myself smiling and chuckling a little bit, even right off the bat in the opening sequence where Jigen and Lupin are running away from the casino. All of these goons get in their cars to find them sawed in half. That made me smile. I think the movie kind of gets a little weaker as it goes on. I think I've sort of got two sort of major issues with the movie, and one is that there's like only two female characters. One of them, oh gosh, I think her name is Clarice. She's the princess of this fictional country of
Cagliostro.
Her character is very much a damsel in distress the entire time. She has very little agency and doesn't really do much. And like Lupin is sort of just like creeping on her for like a part of the movie, and she's just okay with it. Like she's down with that, which was sort of bizarre to me. I think Lupin is like, I'll save you, but only if you're my reward. And she's just like, oh, how romantic. And I was just kind of sitting there like, what? The other female character, Fujiko, she seemed like a really interesting character that I wish I got to see more of. She's sort of the exact opposite of Clarice. Still not confident that's the right name, but I'm too lazy to look it up. She's like out there throwing grenades, shooting people down and stuff. We don't really get anything about who she is other than that she once was in love with Lupin and she sort of works with him, but like isn't afraid to screw him over. I just wish that she had a bigger part in the movie, and it just seems like she was there because she's one of the Lupin characters. She had to be there instead of actually having a role in this movie. I think I could say that about some of the other recurring Lupin characters, like the samurai guy. I don't remember his name at all because he didn't do anything in this movie. He was just there hanging out and then helps out at the climax, and that's it. I think this movie probably could have better utilized its cast of recurring characters, but I guess that's a third issue. The other big issue that I had is the villain. I think that he was kind of one note and didn't really have a lot going on when he could have. From what I understood, he was just born evil and is evil just because he's just a rich asshole and that's his whole character. I feel like, I don't know, you could have made him more of a character. Like, he could have had more going on other than just like, oh, I'm here, I'm evil, I'm gonna steal the gold and gonna counterfeit money and I'm after treasure. I think the villain like has the potential to be like the strongest character in any story. This guy definitely was not that. Kind of disappointed there, I think. But ultimately, I think this movie was still really fun despite all of the like sort of criticisms that I have. It's definitely worth watching, and it's by no means a bad movie. I would actually say it's pretty good. So I think what I would give this movie, again, just as a gut reaction, I would say 7 out of 10. It's fun. It's a good sort of popcorn movie to be able to like turn off your brain to. And yeah, overall, pretty happy with it. As much as I've got some criticisms, it's a good time and it's worth watching. So that's that. I just watched Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. This is the second film that Miyazaki has directed. I think I loved it. I think there's things about it that I really loved. I have some things that I'm going to complain about, which I'll get to in a moment, but overall I think it was a really beautiful experience. This movie is set a few hundred years after the world has been polluted to a point where like these big monolithic creatures have come up and just destroyed humanity. Humanity is now living in sort of these remnants and kingdoms in self-contained countries all around that are still very much warring with each other, while most of the surface of the Earth has been covered in this jungle. The jungle is full of spores that are poisonous to human beings and will kill anyone who walks in there pretty much within like 5 minutes, I think they say. It is also infested with giant insects, and the giant insects are one of the coolest parts of this movie. They all look so dope and so gross. It's awesome. Nausicaa is sort of the princess of this one pretty small kingdom where all of the people pretty much live in harmony with nature. They have been untouched by this jungle, and most other kingdoms don't interact with them. One day, an airship carrying a piece of one of these old monolithic beings that destroyed the world crashes in to the cliffs around the Valley of the Wind. Soon following, the military force of the nation who that ship belonged to come and occupy and invade the Valley of the Winds, setting Nausicaa off on this journey. This movie is very well known for having a very environmentalist attitude, and I think that's awesome. I'm here for it. I think some of the other big bonuses for me are the creature design and the character design. As always, Miyazaki's killing it. I think it's sort of interesting that they had this sort of medieval look to them, like in their dress, but also had these like really cool steampunk airships and all of those things. Of course, Miyazaki loves like aeronautics and all of that, and that's very much on display in this movie. And like some of the action set pieces with all of these airships are mind-blowing. Also, the backgrounds, the sort of painted environments are beautiful. They very much reminded me of Made in Abyss, if anybody has seen that. I can see where that series would have gotten its inspiration from this movie in a lot of ways, especially in the jungle itself. Like, I was just straight up thinking, wow, this like some of the scenes from Made in Abyss look exactly like these environments. Also, the music is so cool. Like, there's some very memorable like orchestral moments along with these driving 80s synths through the action bits. It's killer. It's really cool. As far as the things about this movie that I didn't like, the first and most obvious is, so Nausicaa has this glider that she uses to fly around and adventure with, and it's really cool. Except, like, there's this constant upskirt going on, and it's so distracting. It didn't need to be there. Like, I mean, she's wearing pants underneath, at least. But why, Miyazaki? Why would you do this? That's not necessary whatsoever. I think that really took away from the film for me. Just annoying and unnecessary. The other thing that bothered me is that, like, the dialogue in this movie is super clunky. I don't know if it's just the dub, but everybody's constantly explaining everything to you as you go along. I don't need that. People don't always need to be talking and explaining what's happening to me. I can see it. The beginning of this movie is a very good example of that, where Nausicaa is sort of going through the jungle and she finds this, giant carapace of one of these massive bugs, and the entire time she's sort of explaining it to us. Oh, this is the giant carapace of this bug, and it's like, okay, I can see that. She's constantly talking to herself, and it's not necessary. And this goes on throughout the film. Like, even when other characters are talking to each other, it's just clunky exposition. I think this movie could have trusted its audiences a little bit more. Again, I don't know if that's just a problem with the dub or if the sub is like that as well. Still, it's something that I noticed and took away from the film for me. Oh, one other thing that I noticed, this is just going back to the character design, the gas masks that they all wear. Okay, I think this is hilarious. I don't know if this is true, but this is the headcanon that I'm coming up with. So, like, the gas masks that all the people of the Valley of the Wind wear have these, like, sort of flaps on the side. And I didn't understand it at first. Like, why are these massive, like, flaps here instead of, like, I don't know, cylinders or something? But almost all of the men, like the older men from the Valley of the Wind, have these massive mustaches. They're like this big. And so I think those cylinders are meant to contain people's mustaches. Comment down below if you think I'm right or totally off base. Yeah, but overall, I think I still really love this movie. It's got its flaws and it stumbles in places, but you can really see the sort of distinct identity that Miyazaki is carving out for himself here. This sort of like dystopian fantasy world, and you get that element of like this magic and surrealism that is sort of present in a lot of the later Miyazaki films, as I understand them, having only seen like a handful. My gut reaction is an 8 out of 10. I think an 8 is a solid rating for this movie, just going into it. Okay, yeah, that's that. Okay, I just saw Castle in the Sky, the first true Studio Ghibli film. First off, I'm just going to say I'm sorry that the video quality for this segment isn't going to be as nice as the other ones. I'm too lazy to go get the DSLR and get that whole thing set up because it's super late and I haven't slept much in the last couple of days. Castle in the Sky. It was, I think, on par with Nausicaa. I think it was really lovely. There's some things about it that I'm going to complain about, but overall, it's still like a really, really excellent film. So to give a little recap, not recap, but like spoiler-free version, Castle in the Sky is the story of Patsu and Shita. Shita has been kidnapped by some government agents until pirates attack, and long story short, she gets lost and meets a young boy named Patsu, and Patsu is obsessed with finding this fabled city in the sky called Laputa, and Laputa is essentially the big myth of this world where nobody believes it's real, but it's this giant floating city that is filled to the brim with treasure. They go on an adventure to try and find Laputa and discover its secrets. And yeah, I think this movie was great. It feels a lot more like a kid's movie than Nausicaa did. It was a lot less, I think, gritty than Nausicaa. Nausicaa wasn't a very gritty movie, although it had its sort of gnarly moments to it when it wanted to. This movie also had a very strong environmental theme to it, not as on the nose as it was in Nausicaa. It sort of, in this movie, just sort of comes up in the last maybe third of it, whereas Nausicaa the entire time was very clearly like, oh, this is a story about environmentalism. This one sort of builds to it. I think you get a lot more out of this movie if you've seen Nausicaa. There's a couple nods to Nausicaa in this one that I wasn't expecting, that I thought were cool. Like, I recognized some of the orchestral arrangements as being very, very similar to Nausicaa's, and at first I was like, you sure about that? But then I think as the film went on, I realized that it was more intentional, which was pretty cool. I think this movie actually does better on its antagonists in some ways than the previous couple of movies. Nausicaa had some bad guys that had some personality to them and were interesting, although they were still sort of one note. Whereas I really, really liked the pirates, the Dola gang, being led by Mother. Mother was an excellent character. Best part of this movie was Mom, all of her man children. That was very fun. They were all very fun to watch throughout the movie. Although I do think the other antagonists, the government people, I think were a lot less interesting in comparison. The time spent on them was like, I wish I was watching the pirates instead. So I'll get to some of my gripes. I think the biggest of which is still the dialogue explaining everything to you. I think it was a little lesser in this movie than it was in Nausicaa, but it was still like kind of annoying to me. I was being force-fed a lot of this stuff when I could just, like there's show don't tell, Miyazaki, please. So that was a bit of a bother for me. Again, it might have just been a problem in the dub more so than the sub. I think I at one point got sort of fed up and just like turned on the subtitles and still had the English audio going because Netflix is weird, and when you turn on the subtitles, it's the like actual subtitles from the Japanese audio rather than the subtitles from the dub audio. So it doesn't quite line up. So like I could see the differences in the actual dialogue from the sub versus from the dub. Like it was still going on, but I think it was maybe delivered a little better in the sub. I'm not sure. I only did it for a little bit because I, for some reason, committed to all of the dubs for this. I should have gone with my heart here as a sub purist and not betrayed my kind, but alas. Another sort of issue with the dub that I had was for Shita kind of being our main character here. The accent was so janky. It came and went a lot. She sort of had like a almost English accent, but it wasn't there the entire time. It just came and went and was very strange and just sounded weird every time it sort of found its way into her speech. I don't know, like the robots were sick. The airship design, again, always going to be cool. I feel like I'm probably not going to need to say that every single time, just like how I'm not saying the animation is cool every single time, because it's just going to be sick always. Yeah, I think this film, I'll give it an 8 out of 10 as well. I think it's about as good as Nausicaa was and makes a really good companion piece to Nausicaa if it is a little bit more childish than Nausicaa was. Still a really great film, really good time, and that's that. Okay, I just saw Grave of the Fireflies by Isao Takahata, and oof, is that the word that I'm looking for? This was a really beautiful movie. I really felt a lot of feelings while I was watching it, which I think is the point. This has been a really big departure from the rest of the movies as of yet. This movie has a very much more serious tone than definitely Lupin and Castle in the Sky. But Nausicaa was a fairly like serious movie, but still had a tone of adventure and a lot of fun to it. Whereas this movie, while there's fun and while there's a lot of levity in it, it's a very much more harrowing experience. It's really beautiful. Again, that needs not be said. And every one of these movies is going to be gorgeous, but it's a lot more of an adult film than any of the Ghibli films that I've seen so far. Okay, where to start? This movie is about two kids whose names I've already forgotten. Setsuko and Saita. Saita is a young boy who is forced to take care of his sister after their city is bombed by the Americans after World War II. Not after World War II, in the last months of World War II. This movie is their story, how they get through these last months of the war and have to deal with the American, well, not just the American bombing, but the way that they are treated and sort of cast aside by the rest of their society. This movie was released on the same day as My Neighbor Totoro, which is sort of, I guess, an interesting fun fact. Apparently, it was marketed like in the same way that Totoro was, and was very much intended to be shown to families. And yeah, this is definitely not a movie that a kid should watch, or that a kid would necessarily understand. Well, not that a kid wouldn't understand it, I just think it's better not showing this to kids. Like, it's a little too heavy, I think. But still, it's a really gorgeous movie and a really heartfelt movie. It's one of the most realistic and brutal depictions of war. This movie really doesn't pull any punches when it doesn't want to. It's got some pretty gnarly moments here and there that are genuinely shocking. And there's this constant dread that is lingering behind every kind of moment. This might have just been me being confused. It was intentional that you don't know when the air sirens are actually happening or not. There were some points where it seemed like an air raid was about to happen, but then nothing happens. So I was a little confused by that. So unless I'm just like reading into something and just didn't pick up on it properly, it's sort of like, I think, intentionally meant to put you off kilter when you don't know when you're in danger and when you're safe, because there's a lot of moments where the contrast between danger and safety is really, those lines are just blurred. So I think that was sort of cool, unless I'm just totally wrong and didn't understand something. I think this movie, to get into some of the things that I didn't like. So the beginning of this movie is a mind-blowing sequence of sort of the horrors of this war and what's happening. And then for the rest of the movie, the next 2/3, it really, really slows down. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I don't think this movie would be quite as watchable if the entire way through was the same as that first sequence. But I don't think there's any point in this movie that hits as hard as the beginning does. The ending is a very, very emotional, but I was still more affected by the beginning of this movie than any other part of it. So I guess it sort of, to me, felt like it, yeah, just kind of slowed down a lot, and everything past the beginning, while beautiful and meaningful in its own way, didn't quite hit as hard as that first section. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. It's a gorgeous movie. People should watch this. It's known as one of the best war movies of all time for a reason. And there's a lot that this movie says that I don't necessarily want to spoil. I'll give it an 8 out of 10 as well. I think it really rides the line between an 8 and a 9 for me. Like, do I think it's better than Nausicaa or Castle in the Sky? I think that it's, yeah, in some ways it's better. But I think those movies just have a funness to them that makes them a bit more of an enjoyable watch. Whereas this is a movie where it's like, okay, it's gonna hit you and it's gonna be really beautiful, but then it's also gonna be kind of slow. And then that's not to say I don't like slow paced things. It's just that this one was a little too slow, I guess, for me. But that's my Zoomer brain talking. Can't go without stimulation for 2.5 seconds. But yes, this movie's great. I'd probably say it's the best out of everything that I've seen so far. Watch it. So I just watched My Neighbor Totoro, and oh my gosh, I loved that so much. That's so good. So, just to give a little synopsis quick, My Neighbor Totoro is the story of two young girls, Satsuki and Mei, who have moved to a small town in rural Japan, their dad, while their mom is in the hospital. One day, stumble across a great forest spirit, which is only known as Totoro, and go on some adventures with Totoro. This is just like a really beautiful story about the magic of childhood and growing up and having to be a kid and not necessarily understand everything that's going on. In some ways, it was really similar to Grave of the Fireflies, but was also like the polar opposite at the same time. Like there's a lot of similar elements, like, you know, the story of two kids, one being older and one being almost a toddler. There's a lot of other similar sort of aesthetic things. This movie has something that's really, really special about it. And, well, like, not a ton happens in this movie. Everything that does just has so much wonder and magic to it that it's really hard not to just adore everything that's happening. While Grave of the Fireflies like has a lot more to it than this movie does, this movie I think still edges it out because it's just heartfelt and gorgeous. I cared a lot more about Satsuki and Mei more than I did the two kids in Grave of the Fireflies, which is interesting because those kids are in some way just as adorable, and their story is like more heartbreaking than anything that happens in Totoro. But I just think that this is the better movie. I don't know. I don't think that's a hot take, but it might be to some people. Sorry if it is, but that's just again, all of this is my opinion. I think the only thing that I would complain about in this movie is that there's just not enough Totoro. I want to see more of his world and what he's got going on and what he's up to. I kind of wish that Satsuki and Mei got on the cat bus with Totoro to see where he was going. I think this movie would have benefited from a bit of a longer runtime because I just want to be wrapped up in that magic a little longer, I think, and really get to know Totoro and what his whole deal is other than him just sort of being there. Like, I think there's something really cool about not knowing all that much about Totoro, but it also feels like a little bit of wasted potential where this movie could have done a little bit more with it. This one's a 9 out of 10 for me. It's real close to a 10. I debated just going all out and going for a 10, but I think that there's still, like, you know, that little bit of something that holds it back a little bit for me. But it's still, I think, one of my favorites. It's definitely my favorite one that I've seen so far. In my ranking, it's, at the moment, number 1, and Grave of the Fireflies is number 2. We'll see where we go from here. This is just a classic, like, hands down. It's one of the greatest works of animation ever, I would say. Like, it's that good. There's a little bit more that it could have been, but is still absolutely amazing. Watch this movie. Okay, so tonight's movie was Kiki's Delivery Service. This was another one of Miyazaki's films. It was cute, it was fun. I don't really have a lot else to say about it. This is the story of Kiki, who is a 13-year-old witch who, at the age of 13, is sent off to go and spend a year away from home training as a witch, so she can learn the ropes, I guess. And that's really the whole movie. So she leaves home and sets up shop in a city where she ends up starting her own delivery service where she flies on her magic broom across the city and delivers packages. This movie is pretty light on the plot. That's nothing new, I think, from what I've seen other people say about this movie. I think it's fun. It's really adorable, and are some moments in the movie that I felt really, really touched me and really gripped me, but there was also a lot of the movie where I just felt, I don't know, a little lost. Like it was having a hard time keeping my attention, which is too bad, really, because I don't think there's any part of this movie that is bad or not good. It's all really lovely and really nice. It's just not the most gripping. But, you know, with all that said, I think there's still a lot that I think put in the pro column in this movie. Obviously, this is a Miyazaki film, so it's gorgeous. And there's some really lovely character growth and character exploration in this film. I think this is perhaps one of the least developed worlds that I've seen in a Miyazaki film as of yet. Even Totoro, I wanted to see more of that world. It felt like this world was just normal and had witches and they were just fine and nobody cared. It seemed like it would do more with the way people perceive witches and then kind of doesn't. I don't know, maybe I'll come to appreciate this movie more after I've had some time to sit on it and think about it. I just don't have a lot to say about it. I mean, it was good, but it was pretty light on the content, especially since it's about 20 minutes longer than Totoro. I feel like even though not a ton happens in Totoro, not a ton happens here, but it takes longer. I really loved the cat. There was a couple moments where I thought Gigi was just annoying, but for the most part, Gigi was really great. I think my favorite part of the movie was the scene where Kiki went to deliver a present from two elderly women and got to spend some time just hanging out with them, and it was really lovely and really kind of touching. Just this moment where you see somebody's humanity, even though you later on see that the person that they're delivering the gift to isn't necessarily the most appreciative of that person. It's just really lovely to see Kiki able to touch them and make a difference in somebody's life and just be, you know, something kind of wonderful. Yeah, overall, it's good. I'm giving this one a 7 out of 10, but would probably rank Castle a little higher than this one. That's that. Tonight I watched Only Yesterday. This is the second Takahata movie on my list. Wow, I was not expecting that to be what it was. Well, actually, I don't know if that's true. I think I was expecting it to be that, but I don't think I was expecting to love it as much as I did. This is the story of Takeo. She is a 27-year-old woman living in Tokyo. She decides to go out to the country for a summer to work on a farm for a little bit. And while she's going on her trip, she is surprised by the memories of her childhood, of being a fifth grader and that awkward era of her life and what it meant to her. I'd heard that this movie was a little on the slow end, and normally that's a big detractor for me because, again, terminal zoomer brain. I don't know, I think this movie really hit on something that I really loved, and I'm having a hard time putting my finger on it. Really, it was slow and it was very, very mundane, but in that, it was really lovely. It didn't need to be anything more than that to be captivating and engaging and really, really meaningful. Yeah, I really loved this one. This movie, once again, touches on the environmentalist themes and talks a lot about agriculture, so much so that I would call this an agricore film. I think it's a little heavy-handed in that at some points. I get it. It feels more like I'm hearing the writer rather than the characters. Even at that, that's kind of like one of the only complaints that I have about this film. It's long, and I think I did feel that length, but I don't think that it overstayed its welcome. I don't think this is a movie that everybody would be able to just sit down and enjoy. I think I was just, I don't know, maybe I was just in the right headspace for it today, and it just really pulled me into its world, despite that world being a much more mundane one than any other Ghibli film as of yet. It's still just gorgeous and heartfelt and meaningful. You know, it's another coming-of-age story, but I think this one really delves into womanhood and growing up in Tokyo at that era and the two different time periods between the 60s and I guess it would be the 80s. This movie came out in 91, but I think there's probably only like 16 years between the two. I don't remember the exact years. But yeah, it just barely edges out like Grave of the Fireflies for me. I don't think it's as good as Totoro, because Totoro just has something magical about it that hits a little bit harder. Grave of the Fireflies was excellent. It was an amazing film. I think that its slowness, detracted from it though, whereas this movie, it was really its strength. I think I'm going to rate this just slightly higher than Grave of the Fireflies. I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. It's not as good as Totoro, and it's definitely not a 10 out of 10. I love this one. I think if every movie was like this, I feel like I'd have a hard time getting through them all. For being what it is, it's wonderful. So hey y'all, I'm gonna keep this one short because I've got a headache. I just watched Porco Rosso, and what the heck? Who gave this movie the right to be that good? I don't know what I was expecting walking into this one, but it wasn't that. Damn, this movie was great. This movie is about an Italian seaplane pilot named Porco Rosso, and Porco Rosso is a pig, a half man, half pig. He is a bounty hunter on the Adriatic Sea. He fights seaplane pirates for a living, till one day he's challenged by an American pilot, which kickstarts his whole adventure. Porco Rosso is such an amazing protagonist. I don't know what it is. I think part of it might have just been the voice actor for the dub. This is definitely like probably the best dub I've ever seen for any anime ever. That voice actor, I'll have to look up who it was. They did amazing with Porco. Elevated that character to this like stone cold badass. Amazing. I think that the film does have some moments where it gets kind of corny, and that sort of takes away from it. Some of the problems are solved way too easily, just out of the blue, and that was like, why why is this happening? But like overall, it's just really compelling and really well done. I think there's some aspects of the movie that fall a little flat. The movie wants to sort of be a deconstruction of misogyny a little bit, I guess. That's what it seemed like it was going for with Porco a little bit, but it also seemed like it was, again, like I just said, a little too easy. Things don't get solved that quickly. That's like a big problem that would take a lot more work. Regardless, I think that this movie is really excellent and people should see it. I don't think it was as good as Totoro, but I think I am going to rate it above Only Yesterday. I think it just has like a fun quality to it that really, really shines through. It's a movie that I feel like I could just watch on any night and love and have a good time. It's just good. And also, it's damn quotable. I'd rather be a pig than a fascist. Top notch. Me too, Porco. Yeah, I got a headache, so I'm going to end this one quick, but that's that. Okay, so today's movie was Ocean Waves. This film was directed by Tomomi Mochizuki. This is the only film that Mochizuki has directed for Studio Ghibli. It is about a young man who has gone back to reflect on his time in high school. It's very slice of life. It's very kind of slow too. I don't know if there's really too much that I can say about this movie. It wasn't boring, but it also wasn't all that interesting. Pretty much every one of the movies that I've seen so far has something that kind of sets it apart, that makes it unique, makes it its own thing, and makes it a Studio Ghibli film. This one, I think it's not a bad movie. There's just not too much that you can walk away from it with. There's not a lot that sets it apart. And, you know, I think it's got its compelling moments and it's got its heart, but it just doesn't have much. It's definitely one of the shortest Studio Ghibli films, clocking in at just barely over an hour. It doesn't feel long, it just feels slow, and not a lot happens. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Thinking about Only Yesterday, that film was also very slow and took its time. You just got to know the world and the characters a lot better, and you sort of got to fall in love with those characters more. I don't know if this film would have benefited from a longer runtime, like if that would have just made it feel bloated, or if it would have, I don't know, maybe given us that same time to connect to these characters a little bit more. Ultimately, this movie is fine. It's got its moments. It's just not going to leave you with a lot. I think this will be the first 6 out of 10 out of the bunch for me. This movie's pretty par for the course, and there's not much else to say about it. So okay, tonight's movie was Poko. It's like 3 a.m. right now. I was only able to start this movie at 1 a.m. because it was just a really long day. My head hurts, I'm tired, but I loved that movie. That was amazing. It's probably the best Takahata film I've seen so far. Really, really, I think, meaningful and intelligent while still being accessible and fun and entertaining. I think it kind of hits like all the marks in like having a really interesting story, really interesting characters, themes, and hits all of them really, really well. I think some aspects of the movie are a little bit dated and are barriers to its accessibility. For example, I know that they're creatures in Japanese myth and that this is an aspect of the mythological in Japan, but the raccoon's nuts don't need to be out 24/7. That's just not necessary. This film could have been probably as big in the West if it were not as explicit in that sense. I do think that the environmentalist themes could have been a bit of a hindrance to the movie in the West, but This movie is about a forest of raccoons whose home is being threatened by the development of Tokyo, and how humans are encroaching on the natural world, and the animals who are affected by this are just expected to live elsewhere or not really live at all. You just sort of forget about the animals. They're cast aside and they don't seem to matter as much. But those animals have their own lives and have their own need to survive. And yeah, I think it's a really beautiful film for its environmental messaging and everything like that. Again, unfortunately, I think a lot of people in the West only really adopt those ideas when it's convenient for them or when it makes them look more appealing to the general public. So yeah, I can see that would be barriers to why this film hasn't really gotten big in the West in the way many of Ghibli's other films have. I think this is probably just one of the best Ghibli films that I've seen so far. Really, really excellent. I'm still gonna put it that one spot under Totoro because I think Totoro just overall as a film has aged better. And this film is kind of long. You never feel that length. It doesn't feel like it's really long, but it's 2 full hours. That might just be a complaint because I was watching it at 1 in the morning. It's still really worth watching, really good. There's some things that you're gonna have to just get past in order to get everything you can out of this movie. But I think despite its couple of flaws there, it's still a really wonderful movie. So yeah, 9 out of 10. Okay, so tonight's movie was Whisper of the Heart, and yeah, that was a good time. I'm definitely feeling fatigued of these slice of life movies that are long. I guess Ocean Waves wasn't long, but it felt long. But I think that this movie was still good despite that. So this is the story of a young girl named Shizuku. She's sort of like just on the cusp of going from junior high to high school and is not like the other girls. She spends all of her time reading and exploring fantasy worlds in books and things, feeling like she doesn't quite know what she wants to do with her life and has responsibilities to help out around her house, while her mother is taking a master's degree and her father is working all day long. So this is her story, how she falls in love with a young boy and she decides to become a writer and write a book about a cat statue that she sees in an antique shop, and that's sort of the latter half of the film. It was really cute and had some really, really meaningful segments in it. I think that there's a lot that's very, very positive about this movie, and it's, I think, very worth watching. I think knowing that it's Yoshifumi Kondo's only entry into the Ghibli film verse before passing away, I think being a meditation on the creative act and how it's sometimes difficult but ultimately rewarding, it kind of recontextualizes the film in a way that makes it more meaningful. Gets you to see it in a bit of a different light once you know a little bit about that. I do think, yeah, it's kind of slow, and I found myself having a difficult time really staying focused while I was watching it. But I think despite that, this is still a really strong film. I just think that once you've binged movies like Only Yesterday, Ocean Waves, even like Totoro has like a slice of life sort of vibe to it. Once you've seen just a bunch of slice of life movies in a row, it just sort of starts to get... There's more to come. We'll see where I'm at by the end of this. Slice of life isn't my genre. Even the Ghibli films that aren't slice of life, most of them are still coming of age stories at least. In any case, I think I'm gonna put this movie also at an 8 out of 10. I really do think it's great, despite my personal issues. In my ranking, I would probably put it above Nausicaa and Castle in the Sky, but under Grave of the Fireflies. I think, yeah, Grave of the Fireflies is just like on the line between an 8 and a 9, whereas this movie is like solidly 8, I think. That's what I'm gonna give it. That's where I'm at. I'm so tired. Good night. Tonight's movie was Princess Mononoke. That's, I think, definitely my favorite out of all of these as of yet. I think that this movie reminded me why I decided to watch every single Studio Ghibli film, why all of these movies are worth watching and important and good. There's just something about this movie that is on a whole other level, even like compared to everything else I've seen so far. To get started, so this movie is about a young prince named Ashitaka who lives in a very, very small village that is one day suddenly attacked by a boar that has been possessed by some sort of demonic force. Because of his battle with this being, despite slaying it, he is cursed and goes on an adventure to try and find some way to cure this condition that he finds himself under. Much of this movie is about the relationship that humans have with nature and the exploitation of nature and all of the ramifications of modernization and the exploitation of resources. I think that this movie is a fully realized version of Nausicaa. I had a lot that I really, really loved about Nausicaa, but I think there were still certain aspects that sort of detracted from it. But I think this movie takes the soul and spirit and blueprint of Nausicaa and builds upon it and polishes it and refines it in pretty much every way. Because I think a lot of beats of this movie and vague story bits are pretty similar to Nausicaa, but I think this movie just does it better. Even if Spirited Away didn't exist, this movie would be more than enough, I think, to put Studio Ghibli on the map. Despite all of my praise, there's still a few things that I think could have been done better. It's not a perfect movie. For example, San, who is the poster character for this film, doesn't have nearly as much screen time as I would have expected. I feel like I wish I got to know her better as a character. Yeah, that might be it. That might actually be the only thing I can think of off the top of my head right now. It is 3 a.m., so I need to stop watching these in the middle of the night. But really, this movie is very, very special. The fact that it terrified me as a kid adds to that a little bit. Wow, this is something that I remember genuinely finding very scary when I was young, versus now I can appreciate it for everything that it is. It's just a completely different level than everything else. This movie is quite scary and quite gory, even much more so than any Ghibli film yet. It's just gnarly, and I love that. I don't know if I have a lot else to say about it. I loved it. It was very good. This is, I think, my first 10 out of 10. It's at the top of the list right now. I think it really deserves that place. Okay, so tonight's movie was My Neighbours, the Yamadas. This movie is one of Takahata's films. Yeah, I think this one's my least favorite out of everything that I've seen so far. Not because it's offensive or even bad. It's a boring movie. It's cute, and in theory, I like the different animation style that this has to all the rest. It's just very, very mundane and kind of lacking substance in a way that none of the other films really have. So this movie is an adaptation of a Japanese newspaper comic strip, and that's it. It's about a family called the Yamadas who are, I guess, supposed to be, we're an abnormal family type of a thing. But really, they're just normal people doing normal people things and having the most normal people problems. Every now and then they crack jokes or get themselves into hilarious but normal situations. Again, I think I've said before that I'm not crazy into slice of life stories. Even the slice of life stories that we've had so far within Ghibli's filmography, they've at the very least had something really human and really meaningful about them. And while this story is got something human about it, it's just not a story. It's basically a series of disconnected vignettes that would be fit for a newspaper comic. If you stumbled across a newspaper and picked it up and saw a 3-panel strip of something from My Neighbours, the Yamadas, then, you might go on with your day after about maybe 15 seconds of looking at it, instead of having nearly 2 hours worth of that. I guess this movie kind of got me thinking about my relationship with newspaper comics. Because when I was a kid, I really loved seeing the newspaper and flipping to the back page just to read the comics and do nothing else. It was something that was really meaningful to me at the time, because some of those comics, had ongoing stories that you could follow. And some of them were just these sort of mid-setup punchline strips that really didn't have anything to them. And while I think, My Neighbours, the Yamadas isn't entirely substanceless, I just think that it doesn't justify a hour and 40 minutes movie. Yeah, it really does capture the experience of watching a newspaper comic for almost 2 hours. I'm going to give this movie a 5 out of 10 because, again, it's not bad. It's not trash by any means. It's just meh. You know, that's why my 5 is a meh, because that's how I feel about this movie. I like the soundtrack, and the animation, I can tell that it's objectively good. I just don't think that it's necessarily my favorite style. Like, there are things that I liked about it. I like especially the environments and the way that characters moved. I don't think I really liked the character design, though, in this. It would work for a newspaper comic, but for a film that's this long, I don't think it's necessarily something that I want to keep looking at. Like, I don't like their mouths. It just didn't look good to me. So yeah, those are my thoughts on this movie. It's sort of hilarious that I go from a movie that's the GOAT, Princess Mononoke, to one that's just like, wow, I do not care about this movie, and will be entirely satisfied with my life if I never see it again. That sounds harsh, but, you know, this movie is just kind of nothing. I feel bad saying that, but hey, if you like this movie, great, good for you. I just feel like, you know, this movie is for people that were old 20 years ago. I don't know, maybe I'm just frustrated because I had to sit through like nearly 2 hours of nothing. All right, I'm gonna stop talking. All right, folks, we did it. We got there. It's the big one. Just watched Spirited Away. And, like, I don't know, what do you expect me to say? This movie's a masterpiece. There's something really magical about this movie, and I think it has its reputation for very good reason. This movie just takes you somewhere else. There's just something about this film that's on a whole other level. It really feels like a beautiful synthesis of all of Miyazaki's films that have come before, being this really, really gorgeous, meaningful experience. This film is significantly less intense than Princess Mononoke is, while it still has its frightening moments and its mature themes. I think this is definitely a movie that's probably a little more friendly for all audiences than Princess Mononoke was. So to give a quick synopsis, this movie is about a young girl named Chihiro who is moving to a new town, having to go to a new school and doesn't know anybody. But her and her parents get lost on the way to their new home and discover what appears to be an old abandoned theme park, which actually in reality is a doorway to another world, a world of spirits, where Chihiro is separated from her parents and then has to find a way to survive in this world by working at a bathhouse that is owned by a greedy witch. There's so many iconic characters and moments. Every little bit of this film is memorable and amazing and beautiful. Like, I can just heap praise on this movie endlessly, as people have done for the past 20 years. But I think this movie really does deserve it. You see Chihiro's journey throughout the film and how this whole experience changes her and helps her to grow up. I don't know if I've mentioned that, half of these movies are all coming of age stories and I'm getting sort of exhausted, but I think this movie is just one of the ways that does it the best. It's a lot more surreal and it's a lot more subtle in its theming and its portrayal of those things. For example, the environmental message, I think, was a lot less heavy-handed in this movie than it was in even Princess Mononoke, and most certainly less heavy-handed than it was in Nausicaa or Castle in the Sky. I think this movie just really handles all of those things quite nicely and allows the audience to think of things on their own and come to their own conclusions a lot more. So I'm a little unsure of whether or not I like this movie more or less than Princess Mononoke. I think Princess Mononoke was a bit more of a coherent narrative. This movie, a lot of the time, it just feels like, oh my gosh, things are happening. So many things all the time. Whereas I think Princess Mononoke had a bit of a better flow to it. But at the same time, I'm saying that and I'm thinking this movie does flow really well. I think it just flows in a bit more of an abstract manner. And I don't know if I can really give it more or less points for that. I do think that Princess Mononoke might just suit my tastes a little better as somebody who likes edgier and more intense filmmaking. But I think that this movie is just also got that little bit more polish. Like Princess Mononoke is a very polished version and a very fully realized story. I just think this one edges it out with a little bit more experience. But I might also at the same time just enjoy watching Princess Mononoke more. It's a hard decision to make, but that's a problem for later me to figure out. Yeah, Spirited Away. It's a masterpiece, 10 out of 10. That's That's the take. This hot take that everybody comes to this video for. Everybody wants to hear me just say Spirited Away is good. I did it. You're welcome. Okay, so today's movie was The Cat Returns. This movie was directed by Hiroyuki Morita. This is the only movie that he directed for Studio Ghibli. I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought it was a good time. This movie is about a young girl named Haru who has kind of been having a hard time with life and just seems to be a little down on her luck and kind of unlucky in general until one day she saves a cat from being hit by a truck. This cat suddenly speaks to her, saying that he'll do whatever he can to repay her, thus causing a series of misadventures, where Haru then meets the figurine that was in Whisper of the Heart, Yoshifumi Kondo's movie from 1995. This is, of course, the cat statue Baron Humbert von Gickingen, pronouncing that as good as it gets. Yeah, going on an adventure. I thought this movie was a really good time. There's a lot to like here. I think it's kind of the most different looking movie than any of the other Studio Ghibli movies. Like, not in its backgrounds or its animation quality, but like the actual character design itself of the humans rather than the cats. The cats still look very Ghibli. Every Ghibli movie has sort of had a bit of a coherent look to it. All of Miyazaki's movies and Takahata's movies, save for My Neighbours the Yamadas, have sort of had the same look to them. Like even Whisper the Heart and Ocean Waves animated their human beings in a way that was pretty visually consistent with the rest of Ghibli's catalog. Whereas this one, people actually had a bit of a more unique art style than the rest. It seemed a little bit more akin to some more conventional anime, which was, I guess, I don't know, just stood out to me. It's not a bad thing at all. It just had a bit of a different look. I really liked this movie. I really liked its characters, its story. It was a lot of fun. It really just left me wanting more. There's a bit of a line between wanting more in a way where it's like, oh, wow, this is great and I wish there was more of it. This movie wasn't long enough to be as satisfying as it possibly could have been, which is, I think, you know, the biggest sort of criticism that I have for it. Of course, originally this movie was going to be a short film that was then expanded upon to be a feature length. You can sort of tell that this movie maybe wasn't meant to be this long, but it could have been longer, I guess, even more so. Like, it's not the shortest movie that we've had so far, but it's definitely one of them. I think it just ended up being a little too quickly paced. This might have been a story that then was something that was smaller and self-contained and then sort of grew to be a little larger, and because of that, they added a bunch of things, but then didn't make those things quite have the time to breathe that would have benefited this movie. Like, it feels like it has a beginning of a middle, and then a rather large end. At least that's sort of how I felt. Like, most other Ghibli films have taken their time, allowed things to breathe and just sort of be ambient. And this movie doesn't do that as much, and I think it would have benefited from that. The other thing that I think bothers me about this movie, or is just kind of annoying about it, is that one of the cats, Muta, is basically the stereotypical fat person, and unfortunately falls into a lot of the tropes that are in like every movie that includes a character that is fat. Oh, he likes eating, everybody's making jokes at this guy's expense all the time, and it's just like, that's every single movie and isn't necessary. It's unfortunate, and I think it takes away from this movie a bit because it's such a common trope and it's just mean-spirited and unnecessary. Of course, the character just deals with it and is like, oh, whatever. But like, I think that that's just still an unnecessary thing to include in movies. Oh, the other thing is, the end of the movie felt rushed, the same way that everything else sort of did. It just felt like the climax moment wasn't quite earned. Not the climax, but like the sort of payoff of the journey. It's sort of interesting the way this movie is structured, and I don't want to spoil anything, but it's sort of like, oh, there's a point where everything is getting sort of explained and a lot of things are revealed. It felt like a lot of those reveals weren't earned and were sort of contrived. I feel like if this movie were longer, I think some of those reveals might have paid off a little bit better. If there were more to some of those reveals, then it would have been better. It did take away a bit. Overall, I still really liked it. I still really thought it was fun. I think this movie would have worked really well as like an animated series. This is one, I think, that especially would have lended itself to like a long form episodic storytelling type of thing being revisited and being expanded upon in a bit of a long form structure. But I don't think that'll happen because that's not really what Ghibli has done with any of their movies or films, and it's okay to let things go. And this was already a sort of sequel in a way, the only sequel within Ghibli's catalog, or a spin-off really. I would call this a spin-off rather than a sequel, because this movie is extremely different than Whisper of the Heart, which it was inspired by. Even so, I think I liked it a lot more than some of the other films that I've watched. I think I would put this maybe like at the top of my 8 out of 10 range. Yeah, that's all I got to say about it. Okay, so tonight's movie was Howl's Moving Castle. I adore this movie. This movie is very, very good, and I like watching it a lot. This really is Miyazaki's third masterpiece. Think Studio Ghibli, and you think Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, and Howl's Moving Castle. And I think that's for good reason that those three movies are the ones that have really resonated with people the most, as far as what I've seen. So to give a brief synopsis, Howl's Moving Castle is about a young woman named Sophie who, after a brief run-in with a mysterious wizard named Howl, is cursed by the jealous Witch of the Wastes and is turned into an old woman and is unable to speak of the curse that caused her to age so quickly. And because of that, she is found by Howl's castle, which is this massive walking steampunk house on legs, and goes on an adventure. There's so much to just adore about this movie. I think this movie has probably the strongest central cast of all of these so far. But here you really do feel like you know not only Sophie, but Calcifer and Howl and many of the other characters in this film by the end of it. It's another one where I feel like I almost wish that I could just spend more time in this world, see more of this adventure with these characters, and just kind of live in that for a little longer than just the 2-hour runtime. And it's a long movie, but it doesn't feel long whatsoever. I think the progression of the plot and everything that keeps happening really works well. I've heard some people describe this movie as being a bit scattered in its plot and that it's kind of all over the place. I fully disagree with that. I think this movie felt very coherent and very, very well paced. Maybe that's just me and I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I do think that this movie moves along really well and is executed really, really masterfully. I think this movie really affects me and speaks to me more than I think Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away did. Like, I don't know if I could say that I liked it more than either of those movies, but I think it just made me feel something more than either of those movies did. It's not meant to really knock either of them. If I had any criticisms of the movie, I do think that while I did say one of the movie's strengths was that I got to know the characters very well, I do think that there were a couple of characters where it's like, oh man, I wish I did get to know them better. Marco, the young boy who's apprenticing to Howl, I kind of wish I knew a little bit more of how he got into that situation of being the apprentice to this guy. Maybe they explained it and I just missed it, but he's just sort of there and didn't have as much screen time as maybe some of the other characters did, which is unfortunate. The end of the film, again, not to give any spoilers, but the denouement specifically, sort of just the short moment after the climax, I just sort of wish that there was maybe a little bit more breathing time there, whereas you get like a few seconds, really a couple of big threads being wrapped up that just get wrapped up very quickly, and it's like, oh, okay, I guess that's the end of the movie. So I wish I could have had a little bit more time to settle in, but really that's all that I really have to complain about. I think that this movie is a masterpiece. I don't know where I would rank it, above or below Princess Mononoke or Spirited Away, because I don't even know what order I put those two in yet, because I think Princess Mononoke just has a level of bite to it that is just something that makes it a movie that I liked watching more, maybe, that sort of blew my mind a little bit more. Spirited Away it's Spirited Away. What else can I say about it? Yeah, this movie just affected me really, really deeply. So yeah, I don't know how I would rank this movie yet, but it's definitely a 10 out of 10 for me. I really loved it. Man, I just almost want to watch those 3 movies over again, but I've got 10 movies to go or something. I don't know. And we're sort of entering into the next era of Ghibli films. I'm now past the 3 that I was really looking forward to, and there's a couple I'm specifically looking forward to out of the rest of them, but part of this whole experience was just an excuse to watch Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, and Howl's Moving Castle. I'm still excited to see the rest. Yeah, that's all I got to say. Today's movie was Tales from Earthsea, the first movie directed by Hayao Miyazaki's son, Goro Miyazaki. Yeah, I understand why this movie has the reputation that it does. It certainly doesn't measure up to what's come before it. While that's unfortunate, I understand why this movie has gotten the criticism that it has. It's deserving of it. To give a quick synopsis, this is the story of some kid. He's a prince, I think, and after doing some bad things at the very beginning of the movie, goes on an adventure and meets up with a wizard named Sparrowhawk. I remember his name. And then, yeah, a lot of stuff happens, but it happens very slowly and in ways that are not satisfying. I feel kind of bad ripping into this movie because I feel like people have likely done that enough, but I'm still going to give my thoughts and opinions about it. I definitely found it really difficult to care from the first, 20 minutes of the movie from the get-go. It's not completely uninteresting right at the start, but it's just, I don't know, it was just very difficult to connect with these characters and to care about them. And I feel like Goro could have developed more of a unique style that would have maybe been something wholly his own than sort of having this like a pale imitation of what Hayao has done, which is, again, unfortunate, but what do you do? I definitely find the sort of story behind the production and reception of this film a lot more interesting than the actual experience of watching this film itself. I kind of went into it not really knowing too much about it, because that's been my intention, but I found myself in certain moments that were quite slow, Googling a little bit of the film's history, and upon a cursory read of the Wikipedia article about this movie, I definitely found the sort of story of like the making of this movie to be more narratively compelling, if unfortunate. I kind of wish I got to see what movie Hayao would have made if he were the one to helm this script rather than his son, because that was the original intention according to the Wikipedia article. And I think that ultimately, the biggest problems with this movie lie with its script rather than its direction. I think the directing is rough and certainly could have been done better, but I think were the script a little better developed and written by somebody else other than Goro, and he given that script to direct, I think he could have done a much better job, because I think this movie, it still has that sort of polish all Ghibli films have, and it doesn't look awful. It's a little muted and flat, but it's not completely valueless. It's just, I think that the script is poorly paced and misunderstands pretty much everything that has come before it in the studio's filmography. Specifically, the 3 sort of big ones, Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, and Howl's Moving Castle. It sort of takes elements from those movies, or it could have taken elements from those movies and the themes that were sort of prevalent and made a through line between them all and built upon that, but it kind of goes against all of those things with its approach to an antagonist. There's nothing wrong with having a good villain, but all 3 of those movies really didn't have a clear villain, and nobody was fully morally good or evil. People are flawed, but even the most flawed people that cause the biggest problems end up being people in the end. Lady Eboshi, or No Face, Yubaba, the Witch of the Wastes, all of those characters end up having so much more nuance to them, whereas that nuance is just not present here. You just don't care about what's going on. Yeah, I feel like, again, this movie isn't awful. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's disappointing. That's, I think, why I would give this movie a 4 out of 10. I think it's just not everything that it could have been. Also, it's too bad that Willem Dafoe, of all people, was wasted on this movie. It would have been great to see Willem Dafoe be a part of the cast of one of the better Ghibli dubs, but it's like, oh wow, he's the villain in Tales from Earthsea and sounds like he's whispering the entire time. That was another problem with this movie. Like, I've never had any of the audio from any of the past Ghibli movies sort of be a problem, but this movie felt like it was mixed kind of poorly. Like, the voices were all really quiet and the music was way too loud. That's never been a problem before in any of these. You know, it happens in movies, but none of the Ghibli movies have been like that, so Okay, I think I've said everything about this movie that I was going to. It's disappointing. Oh well. Tonight's movie was Ponyo. This was a fun time. This movie was pretty much the definition of adorable. I really liked it. I think that it suffers from some of the same problems that some of Miyazaki's earlier films did, that his later ones generally haven't. In that, like, once again, we're back to the days of characters narrating what they're doing for no reason, giving us clunky exposition that might have been better not necessarily explained. Overall, I think I still enjoyed this film and had a good time with it. To give a quick synopsis, this film is about a little boy named Sasuke. He's about 4 years old, I think, and comes across a tiny little fish with a human face one day. This little fish has fallen in love with young Sasuke and decides to become a human. So yeah, there's a lot I really enjoyed about this movie. I think, once again, like, Miyazaki's character designs are just on point. I especially like Ponyo's father. I just really enjoyed that character design. Like, I know that's not much in the way of a praise for this movie. You know what? I like looking at that guy. He's good. There were some really jaw-dropping segments in this movie that blew my mind a little bit. I mean, there's some in almost all of these movies, but the scene particularly where Ponyo was running on top of the waves, I was floored. And I wasn't even standing up. So I think there was a lot about this movie that was really worth loving, but I do think it was a lot lighter than the last few Miyazaki movies. Obviously, this movie is more of a kid's movie than pretty much any of his movies other than Totoro. Although I think Totoro, even despite that, holds your hand a little less than this movie does. And I don't think this movie needed to hold your hand quite as much as it did. Following the sort of three big movies of Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, and Howl's Moving Castle with this one. This one does feel kind of underwhelming in the shadow of those movies. Although those movies also had a much larger scope than this one did, and sometimes it's nice to have that scope sort of pulled back to this small human story once you've done all of these big, massive ones. This movie is very sweet. This movie is very heartfelt, and in some ways it's sort of interesting that this movie is dealing with fatherhood in a way, when Miyazaki's own relationship with his son seems, at least from my limited knowledge, to be a little tenuous. So maybe in some ways this was Miyazaki kind of examining his own absence as a father and maybe wanting to be a little bit more, I don't know, I shouldn't read into it that way. This was Ponyo. This was fun. I think I'm going to give this movie an 8 out of 10. I would probably rank this movie above The Cat Returns, but it's not a 9 out of 10. It's not as good as Totoro, but still a good movie that is definitely a fun time and is a good way to spend a night. Tonight's movie was The Secret World of Arietty. Yeah, this was a good time. I don't think it really, like, grabbed me. It was still, I think, a worthwhile film. I don't really have any, like, big glaring issues that I have with the movie other than it isn't necessarily something that I personally would say aligns with my own tastes. This movie is about Arietty, who is a tiny girl who lives with her mother and father. They are a species, I guess, called the borrowers, who are, you know, essentially house hippos. They sneak around your house at night and get into your snacks, take the small things that they think people won't miss, and use that to survive. One day, Arietty is seen by a young boy, a human boy who is regular sized. It sort of sets off the chain of events that follows in the movie. And I think it was cute. It was fun. It felt very small scale. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It didn't quite compare to the size and majesty of some of the other Ghibli films that I think are maybe a little more entertaining than this one. It's a little slow, not in a really detrimental way, I would say. It's certainly kind of low stakes. Well, it isn't. I feel like the movie lends itself to potentially having higher stakes, and then doesn't feel like those stakes are all that high. Like, they should be higher than they feel, I guess. There could be a little bit more conflict in this story. And it felt like we really only saw a microcosm of this fantasy world once again, where there might have been more out there that would have been cool to see. I have a hard time criticizing something for a lot of these points, though, because I don't necessarily think that having something that's a smaller scale or a lower stakes thing makes for bad storytelling. It just feels a little flat. Even Ponyo, where the stakes in that movie felt a little weird too, but it just feels like more things are sort of happening and those things feel more important. I still like this movie. I don't know if I liked it as much as Ponyo, so I'd probably put it in the spot underneath of Ponyo, but I'd still say it was a good time. It feels very Disney. Like, I think with each movie that's sort of happening, each one is sort of feeling more and more like kind of stereotypical Disney movie. Not a bad thing. Many Disney movies are good, but I'm definitely getting more and more of that vibe, especially with Ponyo and this movie. I don't know if that'll keep going moving forward. Still worth noting, I think Arietty was a really good protagonist. I think there are some really nice subtle touches in there, especially in the animation. Like, I mean, there's always that. The framing and everything with the scale was very well done, like the absolute size of the human beings in comparison to these tiny people, like how absolutely earth-shattering an experience with a being that is that big in comparison to you. I think they really do that well. Although at the same time, there are some moments where I was like, what is the scale going on here? Some things are like super, super small, and some things are like way bigger than you would think in comparison to like the tiny people. I would expect maybe an ant to be dog-sized for her, whereas the ants were more like mouse-sized. Considering her scale in comparison to a blade of grass, it's like, okay, I would expect some of these things to be more consistent, I guess. But at the same time, you know, that's just hard to do, and I don't really think it took away from this movie too much. It's just still something worth noting. I think this one's an 8 out of 10 for me. It was fun. It was good. I liked a lot about it. And that is what I have to say about it. Today's movie was From Up on Poppy Hill. This is the second movie directed by Goro Miyazaki, with the screenplay having been written by his father. I really actually enjoyed this one quite a bit. It's another very slice of life style movie with a bit of romance, but overall I think it was a really lovely movie that really shows that Goro had improved a lot since his last film, with the experience that he gained from that one. In some ways, part of it is the strength of the script and screenplay. I think that's, in some parts, a big reason why this movie is better than Tales from Earthsea. Because of that, Goro was able to flex a lot more directorial skill in this movie than he necessarily was able to in Tales from Earthsea. So to give a quick synopsis, this movie is about a young girl named Umi who is living in Yokohama right before the Olympics in Tokyo in the 1960s. I don't remember exactly what year. She lives at a boarding house with her grandmother and puts up flags every day, signal flags for her father, who was lost at sea during the Korean War several years before. But she still puts up the flags for him just in case. All the while, at her school, many of the boys are trying to save their clubhouse from demolition because the building is old and worn down. But despite that, still means a lot to many of the students who use that clubhouse for their various activities. This movie sort of documents their struggle to keep this building alive. And yeah, I think this movie does a lot of things very well. Nothing in it really blew me away, I would say. Nothing really drove me crazy in a good way or a bad way. But I think it was just still a really strong story, a really fun story, and overall pretty well done. The music was great. The music is always great in every single one of these movies. But I think the blend between a bit more of a traditional sound to jazz sequences for the more intense moments stood out to me as something that I really liked. I don't think I was ever bored during the movie. Today I wasn't feeling all that great all day, and I think this movie, after watching it, sort of helped me feel a little better throughout the day. So I think I really appreciate this movie for doing that. It doesn't necessarily compare to the movies that are a bit more grand, I'd say, than this one. It feels a lot like a return to the sort of thing that Ghibli was doing in the 90s, specifically like a lot of the Takahata films or the films that were sort of brought in by other directors, in some ways sort of reminiscent of Only Yesterday, Whisper of the Heart, and Ocean Waves. I think I would say that I like this movie more than any of those three. In my ranking, I would put it under Ponyo, but over whatever was underneath of that. Again, this movie feels pretty small scale in the same way that Arietty did, but I just feel like this movie grabbed me a little bit more and held my attention a little more successfully than Arietty did. So yeah, I think those are sort of my thoughts on it. It's an 8 out of 10, if that wasn't clear. I'll leave it at that. I just watched The Wind Rises. I have some complicated feelings, I think, towards this movie. I think this is Miyazaki's most mature movie, and I think it is quite nuanced and very, very masterfully executed. Again, there are some mind-blowing sequences in this movie, some real feats of animation and storytelling in general. However, at the same time, I do feel like there are some moments in the movie that drag significantly. This movie does drop some potential plot threads that end up being, I think, wasted opportunities. To give a quick synopsis, this movie is a biopic of Jiro Horikoshi, remembered the name, who was a designer of fighter planes during World War II in Japan. And this movie sort of talks about his life from when he was a kid up until pretty much the end of the war. I was a little worried at the beginning of this movie that it would romanticize this particular individual's involvement in the Second World War. I didn't know anything about the man himself before watching the movie, or the planes really that he developed, specifically the one that ended up being one of the most destructive weapons of war that Japan ever produced at that time. I think I was kind of apprehensive coming into this movie, and I think in that regard, I should have had more faith in Miyazaki and his anti-war sentiments, because I think that despite a lot of the movie not really paying too much close attention to the war and caring a lot more about the human drama behind him, this man, and the sort of technical aspects of his work, I think this movie does go out of its way to sort of ultimately comment on the destructive nature of what he created. And especially by the end of the film, which I'm of course not going to spoil, I do think that the way the film ends does sort of adds that nuance that I think this movie needed. I think that there are breadcrumbs sort of placed throughout the movie that do make it feel, as it is progressing, that theme is sort of built upon as the movie goes on. However, like around, I think I'd say the midpoint of this movie, things just slow way down. It got hard to stay invested in what was happening, and I don't know if there's any point in the movie where it picked back up again. I think this movie was at its best when it was sort of showing you the planes and showing you the advancements, but then all of a sudden we're taken out of that world for the sort of romance plot, which is, you know, not necessarily a bad thing. It just felt like a tonal shift from the rest of the movie where things were just not moving. Some of the most interesting parts of this movie were when it sort of had this undercurrent of intrigue hinted towards some of the political landscape of Japan in that era and of Germany in that era, but it didn't do anything with those threads. There's one character who sort of was introduced in this sort of section in the midpoint, and I sort of thought that after a certain scene with this character that, oh, things might sort of pick up a little bit in maybe a way that explores the war a little bit more. I don't know, moral ramifications of that, but then it never does. That character just sort of slowly disappears from the plot, and that's just that. As well as later in the film, it is mentioned at one point that secret police were looking for Jiro, and then nothing really ever comes of it. It's just like, oh, sort of brought up, he moves in with another person, and then it's never talked about ever again. And he just keeps going to work. It's like, did that matter? Did that make any difference other than now that he lives with this guy? I realize when you're making a biopic, you're sort of constrained. You know, you have to be as accurate as you can be with somebody's life story, and I'm sure there were a lot of creative liberties taken in this movie, but at the same time, I think some of the things that happened just didn't end up maybe being the most interesting parts of his life and the parts that were focused on. While I think they were impactful, I don't think that this is maybe the most effective way that this story could have been fully explored. I guess those are sort of my biggest complaints with the movie. There were some really mind-blowing sequences. I found more towards the beginning of the film. It was a little front-loaded, but with like the sort of opening sequence, there is a dream sequence where there's a bit of that Miyazaki fantasy element sort of incorporated, even if just for a moment it was like, yes, man, why can't the whole movie be this? As well as an earthquake sequence, again, right at the beginning of this movie that hit really hard. I don't think there was much in the movie that really measured up to those couple of moments for me, although there are some really beautiful sequences of flying and the different airplanes and even the imagined airplanes versus the real ones flying that I think are really beautiful in their own right. I definitely had a lot more to say about this movie than I did about some of the other ones. I'm really torn on whether or not I would put it at a 7 or an 8. I'm sort of leaning towards putting it at a 7. I think for the moment I will give it a tentative 7. Yeah, those are sort of my feelings on it. I've been talking long enough, so I'm going to stop. Tonight's movie was The Tale of Princess Kaguya. That was a really beautiful movie and a really beautiful experience. I enjoyed it a lot. I think it was quite gorgeous. Anybody who's seen any clip of the animation or any still frame will know that this is just one of the best looking works of animation maybe ever, just from a purely like aesthetic standpoint. So to give a little synopsis of the film, this is the story of a young woman who was found by a bamboo cutter in the woods. She was sort of this tiny little person that he finds growing in a stalk of bamboo. When this bamboo cutter brings her to his home, she turns into a baby. He and his wife then raise her as their own daughter, except she ages at a much faster rate than a normal child would. And one day, the bamboo cutter, after finding more gifts in the bamboo of gold and fine clothing, interprets these things as a sign to bring her to the capital and live a life of actual royalty. He believes she would be happier living that life. He takes his family away from life in the mountains, away from society, into the city. Now this young girl, who is aged much faster than normal, must conform to the standards of the nobility, and that's sort of then where everything sort of goes on from. I do think that this movie once again does drag quite a bit, but I do think that there's no moment when you can look at the screen at this movie and not be marveling at what you are seeing, what your eyes are taking in, all of the watercolor backgrounds with the rough, sketchy animation, all of the blank space, where every frame feels like it was just curated with love for the medium of animation. And I mean, it's sort of hard to say that when, like, you know, obviously I don't know what the conditions were like working on this movie, but even so, I think that what has been created here is certainly an amazing work of art. And one of the, I think, really interesting aspects of this movie is its take on class and happiness. All of the things that are a part of nobility and a part of being a higher class person, and the things that are supposed to make you happy by being a higher class person, don't really make Princess Kaguya, this young girl, happy at all. She feels quite alienated by these traditions and by these things. There's this running theme throughout the movie that where many characters associate class and status and wealth with happiness. No matter how much they have, they always want more. No matter what their intentions are or what their position is, they always want something that will fulfill their happiness. For example, the emperor in this movie, he is the person of highest possible class, the one with the most, and yet, despite having more than he would ever need, as soon as he hears about Princess Kaguya, he thinks that being with her will make him happy and will complete him in some way. He doesn't say that, but I think that's implied in the subtext. That really does expose, I think, what this movie is at its core about. It's about happiness. It's about life. It's about class. Nobody else can tell you what will make you happy. And the things that society tells you will make you happy aren't going to do that. Happiness is not an emotion that is divisible by class. And I think that's really cool. So yeah, I think I'm going to give this movie a 9 out of 10. Obviously, this movie has the most impressive animation out of any Ghibli film. And that's saying something. Is a little long and is a little tough. But I do think that this movie is still a masterwork by Takahata. I gave Poko a 9 too, didn't I? I think I like Poko better than this movie. Yeah, that's all I got. Tonight's movie was When Marnie Was Here. I don't know. This movie didn't really do it for me, unfortunately. It wasn't bad by any means, I think. It didn't really hit the mark for me. The story is about a young girl named Anna who is struggling with depression and struggling with social anxiety and asthma as well. Her foster mother sends her away for the summer to spend it with some relatives in a small town so that she can get away from the pressures of the city. When she's there, she runs into what appears to be the ghost of a young girl named Marnie, kind of a long and sort of heart-wrenching story. And I do think that there is something really meaningful and touching in this story and something that is really beautiful about it. It's kind of hard to talk about that without going into spoiler territory, and I'm going to do my best to avoid that. I guess my biggest frustration with this movie is that it feels very much like queer baiting. For those of you who may not know, that's when you make it seem like there is a queer relationship in this movie or like queer theming undertones or stuff like that, and then fully just go back on it and renounce that by the end of the movie. And this movie, I feel like, does do that. One of the things that people have told me about this movie is that it was a very queer story. For the most part, you do sort of think that it's going there, and that's sort of what the movie is. But there's a twist sort of at the end that completely cuts that possibility out of the story. Not all movies have to be, of course, centered on queer relationships. That's not what I'm saying at all. You can't do this and not know that's how it comes across. The relationship that is built between the two characters is very, very queer-coded. I don't know what to tell you. It just is. And then to be completely denied by the end of the movie that that's what was going on, it feels very underwhelming, I guess, to me. And that aside, the story of the movie is actually is a very beautiful story and a very emotional story and hits a lot of those things. I just feel like it could have been presented in a way that wasn't queer baiting. And so that to me is a frustration. On its own terms, for its own story, there's a lot there, and there's a lot that you could get out of like a second watch of this movie knowing what you know. It's just when you, I don't know, get there the first time, it's like, oh, the way that twist was delivered felt very cheesy to me. In the moment, I was kind of rolling my eyes when they were getting to the reveal. And it's like, oh, okay. The other thing is, I think that this is as far as like a depiction of anxiety and depression and those things, I think this movie did that very well and handled that very well, addressed the things that were very human about it. I think in a way that made it kind of hard to watch, to see Anna pushing away all of these really well-meaning people and to be very hostile toward them. I understand why that is the choice, what that means to the narrative. And I think it's very human, but it makes it very hard to connect with Anna. I think, wow, she's hurting people around her very much. Yeah, I've had a lot to say about this movie, about how much I didn't like it, I guess. But overall, I'm still giving it a 6 out of 10 because, yeah, I do want to recognize the fact that there are some really, really strong moments and things in this movie. Yeah, that's all I got. Tonight's movie was The Red Turtle. This movie is really amazing, and I really, really, really loved it. This movie was the first non-Japanese Ghibli production, being a collaboration between Studio Ghibli and a Dutch director, Michiel de Dock de Wit, which I'm really hoping I pronounced that right. And this movie is about a man who's in a real 3-hour tour situation. He gets cast away on an island. Every time he tries to build a raft to attempt to escape, he is prevented from doing so by a large red sea turtle. And I won't say any more because I don't want to spoil anything. But I think that this movie is really a masterpiece. Like, I can't think of anything that I really want to complain about. The whole film is told without using any words, except I think the word hey is said 9 times. That was what I counted. I might be off. Yeah, this film really has a lot to say about mankind's relationship with nature and on loneliness and companionship, what it means to have a family. It's not long, it's pretty short, but it uses all of that time so well, and it doesn't hold your hand at all, and it doesn't need to. One of the things that I first thought was maybe a little annoying, that as I sort of consciously realized, it really grew on me. This film doesn't show you everything in the way that most movies would, I guess. When a character looks around and in their environment, the movie won't show you the rest of the environment because it doesn't need to. It doesn't show you anything more than what needs to be shown. For example, there's one point where he's swimming underwater and all you see is him like look left and look right under the water, and part of me was like, I want to see what he's looking at, but it doesn't matter what he's looking at because there's nothing there and you don't need another shot. Whereas I feel like any other movie you would sort of get like a, I don't know, some kind of pan that would show you that where he's looking there's nothing. But I don't know, that's just a thing that I noticed. I think this movie is something really special and really beautiful. I think that nobody knows about this movie at all. Most people like almost don't even consider this a Ghibli movie because it wasn't produced or directed by a Japanese director. I really adored this movie. I'm gonna give it a 10 out of 10, which I wasn't expecting to give anything else, much less this sort of like random movie that is almost unheard of. I think this movie deserves it. I think this movie does so many things so well, and I think it deserves more recognition. Okay, so I watched Earwig and the Witch tonight, and I see that this movie had a lot of potential that it didn't quite live up to. I think the sort of popular opinion of a lot of people was that, oh, this movie is CGI, it's bad. I actually liked the animation. That wasn't where I take issue with this movie. I think this movie has a lot more problems just in its story and structure more so than its aesthetics. But to give a quick synopsis, this movie is about a little girl named Earwig whose mother was a witch. When she was a baby, she was dropped off at an orphanage only to be picked up years later when she's probably around, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12, when she's adopted by a witch who puts her to work in her home and is quite cruel to her. But all the while, you sort of get little glimpses into the history of this witch she's been adopted by, Earwig's mother, and this other guy called the Mandrake who lives with this witch that has adopted Earwig. That's kind of all that this movie is, though. This movie hints at a larger world and a more complex setting and some interesting lore, and then does nothing with it. At the beginning of the movie, there's something mentioned about like a council of 12 witches or something, and you think that might be important, but then it just never comes up again. Same with Earwig's mother. You think that, I don't know, there might be something there, and it's just not brought up again. This movie is based off of a book by Diana Wynne Jones, who is also the writer of the book that inspired Howl's Moving Castle. However, the book was never completed. What was published of this story was actually the unfinished version of it, because unfortunately Diana Wynne Jones had passed away. From what I understand, this was a pretty one-to-one adaptation of the story as it is. It feels very incomplete and it feels very stilted. There's more to this story that just wasn't told because it didn't exist. So I think that's where a lot of my disappointment lies. It's just not a complete story. It feels like a beginning and then a beginning of a middle, and that's it. Despite the fact that it feels like a beginning and a middle, it still feels like it overstays its welcome because it spends so much time on some of these things that are ultimately really not important. There's some aspects of the characters that I really liked, and then some aspects of the characters that I thought was really annoying. Like, for example, Earwig is a very annoying protagonist. She's constantly belittling those around her and thinking only of herself, and you would think that the natural progression of her character arc would be that, oh, by the end of the film, she'll learn to be more kind to others around her and more giving, rather than being sort of manipulative. But then the end of the movie is just like, oh, no, she's still manipulating everybody around her. Or maybe she sees herself as manipulating everybody and not understanding the kindness that they are showing her now. Kind of unfortunate. And she's also explaining everything that's happening in the movie all the time. I don't need to be told all of Earwig's inner thoughts. You know, show don't tell. The witch that adopted Earwig, what was her name? Bella Yaga, I think. She's just mean all the time. And again, you think that she would end up having some sort of a character arc where she would start to care about Earwig, even though at first she only sees her as some tool, I guess. But no, she doesn't really have a character arc. She's just basically told by the Mandrake to do something and then does it. But I really did like the character of the Mandrake, because it seemed like he had more going on and more sort of under the surface that would have been really interesting to explore. And the whole history with the band, I actually understand that that was something that Goro added to the movie. The music aspect wasn't really a part of the original story, and I wish that there was more of that, like that Goro had given himself the freedom to expand upon this musical element in this backstory that is only hinted at and never executed. Because I found those were the most interesting parts of the movie, where I was the most engaged. Whereas all of the time where Earwig is just kind of messing around in only 2 rooms of this house that most of the movie is set in, that would have been a more interesting movie to sort of see this whole world and how it culminates in Earwig being here, rather than, oh, Earwig is here and that's it. Credit where credit's due. I do think that there were parts of this movie that were entertaining and were sort of fun. The sort of music scenes, I think they could have been more dynamic, but I think it was still sort of cool to see, like, oh, like, there's this whole, like, sort of 70s rock thing going on, and that's kind of rad. There were a couple of moments where the jokes landed and made me laugh, and I really did like the animation. You know, there's some moments where it's stilted, and some moments where it's clunky, but for the most part, I really liked the sort of cartoony aspect of it. I think a lot of people look at, like, Pixar movies and think that, oh, this is what every CGI animated movie should look like. But I really like the fact that this one took a bit more of like a cartoony approach to it and wanted to be more akin to something like a stop motion animated film, and wanted to have that look to it. Everything looked like it was sort of like a clay model. I prefer 2D animation over 3D animation. I would very much like more films to be produced in 2D animation by like studios like Disney and stuff like that. But for what this movie is, and for what Goro was trying to do with it, again, there's room to grow, but for the most part, I wasn't upset by any of the animations. The dubbing in this movie felt like it was really off from the lip flaps. I don't know if it's just a harder thing to do with CGI than it is 2D, so take that however you will. That was probably the most distracting aspect of the animation for me, and that's not the animator's fault. Yeah, those are my thoughts on Earwig and the Witch. I had a lot of them. I'm giving this movie a 4 because I don't think it's bad. I think it's disappointing, but not bad. And I think there's room to grow. So, yeah, that's that.